good morning, everybody. Eric, nice to see you again.
Good to see you, Elizabeth.
So it's Elisabeth and Eric here.
It's like a vaudeville act.
For the final segment of this particular sort of triptych of preparing your business, selling your business, and then what happens after you sell your business. Going forward after today, we're going to sort of do a little bit more ad hoc stuff, talk about some other areas of interest to business owners and former business owners. But for today, as you know, I'm Elisabeth Colson. I'm a partner here at Devry Frank. I've been here for about 13 years in the corporate commercial department, and I have a very broad-based commercial practice focusing in particular on mergers and acquisitions. And Eric, I'll let you introduce yourself, and today's sort of going to be a spotlight on you. We have some questions for the owners post-transition that I think will really be helpful for.
Great. I'm Eric Gilboord. I'm the CEO of Warren BDC, Warren Business Development Center. And basically what we do is we work with owners of established companies, typically but not exclusively boomer age owners. So those are folks that are 50 years old plus. Most often they've run companies for 10 or 20 or 30 years. And we help them increase the value of the business prior to selling, and then when the owner is ready and the company is ready, we can bring buyers to the table.
So how long, jumping right into it, how long would you say it takes to get into the post-transition stage? I mean, I know what the answer would be from a legal perspective, but what's your side?
Well, it's interesting because, sometimes you sit down with an owner who wants to, talk about transition, and you try to tell them it could be 2 or 3 or even 4 or 5 years, depending on what the relationship is with the company, who it is that they're selling to. Sometimes you get an owner who says, "Well, I want to get out in 90 days. I have reasons for wanting to get out of the company," and they can, in their minds, they'd like to be out in 90 days. They don't want to have any relationship after that. So it's from one extreme to the other. There's no real finite answer. Figure on average a couple of years to, and we're talking about going past the stage of finding the buyer. Let's assume that you find the buyer, you make the transaction, you sell the company, and then there's a period of transition. And typically somebody wants you around for 6 months or a year or 2 years. It's not uncommon for owners to cut deals with buyers where perhaps they sell a percentage of the company, maybe 70% of the company, and they hang on to 30%, and they stay on for 3 or 4 or 5 years. And then at that point, there's always an opportunity to then sell the remaining shares to the buyer. But it gives them a chance to have the buyer take advantage of the owner's experience and expertise and connections with customers and vendors. And so, depending on what kind of deal you cut and what your relationship is between buyer and seller, it can go anywhere from months to several years.
Now, I would say that the same thing sort of applies on the legal side. We've spoken before about how it takes about 2 years from the time that you want to value the business, set up everything properly tax-wise, move through the sale process, and that could include certainly a consulting period or a transitional period during which the owner remains involved to some degree. And you're right, some consulting arrangements go on for 1 or 2 years post-closing, so that could certainly extend the owner's ongoing involvement. I guess a sort of adjunct question to that would be, how often do you see owners who want to stay in touch with their customers or vendors or staff? And I mean, some people might sort of say at first, well, why would they? They've sort of shut the doors, they've washed their hands, they're on a new stage in life. Do you see that often, that people sort of want to stay in touch for various reasons?
I think they're torn, and to me, it's just a human, natural thing to do. You've developed relationships with customers or vendors or staff or what have you over a period of, in many cases, decades, 2 or 3 or even more decades, and there's a gray area between being a customer and a friend, or a vendor and a friend, and so you've got to make a decision about whether you want to continue that relationship. You don't want to interfere with the new ownership of a company. So
Yeah, you often can't.
yeah,
right.
so you get that, yeah, you often can't legally. So you get that gray area where we do get the question probably more often than you think. It's kind of, should I, or can I, stay friends with these folks? And I think that, like a lot of things, sometimes you need to have a break, and sometimes you need that break in order to determine where you are mentally and emotionally. And while you think you may want to retain a relationship with various folks, you may find that once you've had that bit of a mental break of, say, 3 or 6 months, you don't necessarily have the requirement to have that relationship any longer.
That makes sense from a social perspective too. I would just think that as well, any owner who does that, or any former owner who does that, would have to be careful about not breaching any sort of non-competition or non-solicitation obligations. And it's sort of strange, I guess, when you're out for dinner with a friend, but you just have to be careful about what you say, because an owner would typically be bound by certain restrictive covenants when they leave the business. So you're right about maintaining it in a social context. How would an owner deal with sort of, I don't know what to do with myself after? I know you've got a list of about 75,000 things that one can do. But what does one do day to day? Because retirement can really be a daunting thing. It might even seem, the luxury of time, which is a luxury when you're working and are busy, can take on very different meanings when that's what you have lying out in front of you.
It's interesting, Elisabeth. It's one of the early questions that you get from owners is, well, if I sell, what am I going to do with myself?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what to do. I've worked in the business for a long time. Typically, your personal life and your business life are kind of wrapped up together, and it's difficult to imagine yourself not having the place to go. And we talked about kind of that post-transition period where you've got a bit of a call it a gray area where you can start to remove yourself from the day-to-day activity, and that's going to help you ease your way into leaving the company. But you're also dealing with owners of businesses, and these folks by their very nature are leaders, they're achievers, they're people that like to grow things, or they wouldn't be in the position that they're in. So to imagine that that they will go from running a vibrant company to not doing anything, or quote unquote travel or play golf. I mean, the truth of the matter is that you can only travel so much before you get to a point where, okay, I've got it out of my system.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't mean you're never going to travel again. It just means that there's that initial 6 months, year, maybe 2 years where you do a whole bunch of trips. Golf can only occupy you for so much, and then you get to a point where you really need to do other things. And well, I'd like to think I have a list of 75,000 things. I know you were kidding. It's a list of 75 things to do after you transition your company. And in fact, we'd be happy to send that list out. It's in a nice graphic poster format. We'd be happy to send it to anyone who wants to write to us and ask for it. But they're truly, I sat down one day and I thought, okay, I'm getting this question all the time. So let's come up with a list. And it took me maybe 45 minutes
Mm-hmm.
to come up with this list of literally 75 different things that one could do. It's anything from buying another business to doing philanthropic work, and we'll talk about that in a couple of minutes, to perhaps helping your spouse or your child with their company, helping other folks with their companies. There's lots of non-business things to do, and you can learn another language. You can, I know we talked about travel, but you can travel to other countries and do good work. I mean, the cliche is building wells in third world countries, but the last time I had this kind of a conversation with an owner about doing that, he sat there smiling at me, and his wife was with him in the office. And I said, well, what are you smiling at? And he said, well, we did that last year. And they hadn't quite retired yet, but there's a huge requirement for many owners to give back. So you can do things that are personal, rebuild a car. You can do all kinds of activities. And like I said, if you sat down with a blank piece of paper and just said to yourself, okay, how would I like to occupy my time? how much of my time would I like to devote to this activity or that activity? You know, where would I like to be spending my time? And so you need to start to construct some kind of an organization in terms of what you're going to do with your time afterwards. So it might be as simple as, well, summertime will be spent here and wintertime will be spent, you know, somewhere else. It might be, well, I need to get away, you know, once every quarter. It might be, I mean, I know that my wife and I are looking forward to that point where our grandchildren, they're 5 and 10, and we want them to be a little bit older, and we have one that's actually 9 months old, but we want them to be a little bit older so that we can start traveling and taking them, not with their parents, but taking the kids on trips and creating memories. And you know, it's interesting, when you mention things like this to owners, they stop and they go, oh, I hadn't really thought about that, mostly because they hadn't had the requirement to think about it. So, you know, part of our job in terms of working with owners in the post-transition stage is to pose questions and put out ideas that perhaps they hadn't thought about, that they can bite into and all of a sudden realize how, you know, they can go about making really great use of their time. I mean, the idea of taking 13, 14, 15-year-old grandchildren to, you know, to Europe, or to, you know, take them to Venice, or take them to Asia, or take them, you know, anywhere in the world, and take them to museums and things. Those are memories that you're both going to have and value for a long, long time.
Well, you're quite right. I mean, actually, my grandparents used to vacation in Florida for the winter, and I was the only grandchild that they, because I was special, that they took down with them. And so I'd go down for about 4 days, and I was 14, 15, and 16 when I did it. I did it for 3 years. And you're absolutely right. I mean, now, you know, they're long gone, but those memories aren't. So it certainly is something that you can build. And I think also what you're saying is that perhaps it's a shift in the owner mindset. It's not such a drive anymore. Mm-hmm. It's more of an ability to realize that there's time out there, and maybe learning a new skill that might take some time. You don't have to be perfect at it right away. It's almost like a sort of second chance to rediscover yourself.
I know an owner who outfitted a workshop for himself and had never actually really had any experience in woodworking, but had the funds and had the time and had the interest, outfitted an entire workshop and started building furniture. I mean, really, really beautiful work. They were almost like pieces of art. And it's something that they'd never done before.
Well, they're talented people, right? They're driven, talented people,
Mm-hmm.
so there have to be other things within them that they can tap. So we've talked about vacationing and stuff, you know, with the broader family. How would transition impact a spouse or children or other family members?
You know, it's interesting. The first way that it impacts the family, and it's typically the spouse, male or female, doesn't make any difference, but usually what happens with an owner is they sell the business, they go through that transition period, they're now finished working at the company, maybe some odd consulting, but they tend to have their home office set up, likely in the basement somewhere, and then they spend the next 6, 12, 18 months trying to figure out what to do with themselves. And you know, how does it impact a spouse? It typically gets to the point where you've been not at home for decades, and the spouse has their way of running the home and their way of living their lives during, you know, that time of the day and that time of the week, and all of a sudden you're there. And what I find hilarious is that more often than not, the spouse just turns around to the quote-unquote retired or transition business owner and says, when are you going to get the hell out? It's like, just get out of the house, go and do something, go and you know, buy another business or consult or mentor or what have you. You know, sure, it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek what I'm saying, but there's a certain amount of truth to it, because you've now changed the dynamic of the relationship, and it can be a little bit difficult. And you know, children, if you do have children that are perhaps not grown and out of the house, there are some really great advantages. I mean, you're there, you know, during the day. You're there to take them to school. You're there to, you know, to pick them up. I know a number of owners who, you know, their homes are located near their children's homes, and they have a route and they pick up their grandchildren and take them to school and pick them up from school and and bring them home, and that becomes part of their routine. So you're setting up very, very different kinds of routines, and some of those things will be a great assistance to a spouse, and some of them, and an assistance to children. Some of them might not be.
And I guess too, you mentioning we've been focusing more sort of on owners who are selling and looking towards retirement. There's also a whole segment of younger, highly successful people who just want to sell the business that they've grown when it's at its market peak, or so they imagine it to be, and then who simply continue and get into another business and are equally active and remain that way for quite a while. So I would just sort of mention that this, we do acknowledge that it's not everybody that's facing retirement, and there's lots of people who go out and just start another business again.
I know a number of owners that are in their 40s, and they've done exactly what you said. They've bought a company, they've grown it, they've sold it, and in between looking for that next company, they're enjoying every moment of their children, because in many cases their children are public school, maybe high school age, and so they're spending time and again creating experiences that are things that will last an awful long time, but they're not business oriented kinds of experiences. They're just spending time with family, and in a lot of cases they don't want to get into a scenario where they're required to be spending all their time in the new business. They're very, very aware of it's a slippery slope, as many owners know, when you start to get involved in a business that, especially if you really enjoy yourself, you can become, taken over by that business, even though you've already had that same kind of experience. So there's a caution amongst owners in terms of where they allocate their time.
And is there anything in particular that owners should do for staff after the sale, or perhaps leading up to the sale, to make the transition easier for the staff post-sale?
Well, honesty is at the top of the list. Obviously, you want the staff to be aware of what's going on. It's not unusual for owners to put clauses into agreements for sale so that staff are protected for a period of time. And back to the question of family, you may have a child in the business, or you may have a brother-in-law or a brother or sister or whatever in the business, and assuming that person does a good job, then you may want some kind of a guarantee within the agreement that says that person is protected maybe for a few years or so. That said, I know owners that have sold the company, and it's really interesting. They actually went out of their way, and in one case, he did this for, I think, 3 or 4 of his key staff. Now, he did not interfere in the company, once he sold. He waited until these folks were at proper retirement age from the business, and he funded all 4 of them in their own business ventures.
Oh, wow.
So they left the company. He was sitting on a reasonable amount of wealth. He had good experience with them because he'd worked with them for decades. They helped him grow his company. And oftentimes, while someone may spend decades working in someone else's company, there may be something else that they wish to do, their own kind of a business. And he basically staked them in all their companies, which I thought was a tremendously wonderful thing to do for as a thank you, essentially, for your staff.
And also that's interesting. I mean, it also gives him something to do as well. I mean, it depends whether or not he had any sort of equity interest there, whether he was a silent partner, what type of input he had with any of that. And I would imagine also that the businesses would have had to have been non-competitive with the main business sold. So there's lots of implications and considerations in doing something like that. But it's certainly a very laudable and almost, while on the topic, philanthropic approach to things, which is a great segue to the next point that we wanted to touch on today.
The queen of the segue.
Which is generally philanthropy. And we're thinking of having a guest on that topic and for a future webinar, but have any of your owners specifically expressed an interest in that? What have you seen?
Well, it's interesting. I've had conversations, varying kinds of conversations, but one I had was with the spouse of an owner, and we were talking about the impending kind of transition / retirement. And we talked about selling the business for, I don't know, $3 million for argument's sake. And the spouse said, I said, well, we could sell the business for more. We could sell it for $4 or $5 million if we just did a few things to increase the value of the company. And her response was really interesting. She said that they've been very fortunate. They have more money than many of their friends, and I'm quoting, and they don't need any more money. And I thought, well, that's an interesting statement. We don't need any more money. Well, first of all, nobody knows how much you're really going to need, not the way the economy is going and health and politics in the future. Nobody really has a proper answer. But if you step back from that and you talk a little more about the philanthropic side of things, so let's say for argument's sake you could sell your business for $3 million and that's enough and you don't want any more. But if you could possibly sell it for $4 or $5 million, could you not take the extra $1 million or $2 million and do some good with it?
Mm-hmm.
So I can sell it the way it is. I can spend a little bit of effort and make it more valuable. I can take all that extra money and I can help the world. I mean, I can put it into a charity. I can put it into a scholarship. And it's interesting because you may have been someone who ran a $3 or $4 or $5 million business, and the concept of an endowment fund or a scholarship may not be something that's that's common and something that you're used to. But here you are potentially in a situation where you could be sitting on $1 million, $2 million, $5 million, $10 million that you apparently don't necessarily require. So while you could use some of it to put your child, set them up in a business, you could also do things for non-family and help and do a lot of good in the world.
And I guess there it depends, you sort of, the world is one's oyster in that respect. I mean, there can be existing funds and causes to which someone might want to contribute or, set up a certain fund. And then there's others that they could sort of just start for themselves at a particular cause.
These things are not necessarily the exclusive opportunity for billionaires.
No,
you can put together $1 million or $2 or $3 or $5 or $10 million fund or scholarship if you like, and from a legal perspective, there's a certain amount of work that's involved in it, but I don't think it's overly complicated, and it's the type of thing that you likely have experience with.
Yes. I mean, it's it depends on sort of what you would want to do and how you want to structure it, and that definitely that's something that we can assist with. People set up not-for-profits and charitable organizations all the time, and that's certainly one way of doing it. But there's lots of opportunity there as well, and you're right. It doesn't have to be $10 million. It also doesn't even have to be as much as $1 million. I mean, you can make a sort of a totally different target for your annual contribution, or just for starting something off and then see how it grows.
I know a family that were in the retail business for a long time, and the father passed away probably maybe 10 years ago. And in amongst the many things that they did, they decided to make a $500,000 donation to the local university in that person's name. So again, as you said, It doesn't have to be millions and billions of dollars. It can be a smaller amount, but it's all appreciated by the people that you're donating it to. You can simply donate it to your church, and frankly, I've been in meetings with folks that had an entire building. Now, it wasn't millions of dollars. It was probably maybe $400,000 or $500,000. But one of the folks in their church, he'd sold his company. He was sitting on a reasonable amount of money, and he basically donated a building to his church, which I thought was a wonderful thing. So all of a sudden, they actually went from one location to two locations, and that was a huge improvement in terms of what they were trying to achieve.
And it's interesting because it's not even so much that a sale leads to sudden wealth. It can just lead to sort of more accessible income and the opportunity and to have the time to spend it or to use it however one wants. So do you find that owners sort of struggle with the sudden alleviating of the restraints of, now the money is there rather than being tied up in it or allocated to a business?
I think everybody has two thoughts about money, whether it's selling a company or winning the lottery or winning in Vegas. And the initial feeling tends to be, oh wow, I can do all these things, I can buy what I want. And then that's quickly followed by, oh wow, there's a huge amount of responsibility here because I really don't want to blow it. And it's interesting, and if you look at statistics of lottery winners, and let's understand that lottery winners didn't necessarily earn the money that they got, but it's a high percentage, somewhere in the high 90% of lottery winners that lose everything. In fact, they end up in debt. Now, when we're talking about
So I shouldn't buy the 649 anymore?
Maybe we should be smart about it. We'll talk. But owners who run companies, they're obviously in a slightly different position. But let's say, for argument's sake, that, and we've talked about this before, that you have, say, $2 million that's invested, and you have some properties and other things, and you get to that point where you sell your company, and we've always said that typically 80% of your wealth is wrapped up in the business. So let's say, for simple math, you come into another $8 million. So you have $2 million of wealth that you've been nurturing and taking care of over a period of time. Now you have 4 times as much that you're adding to that, and it's a different set of responsibilities. And what can happen is you can start looking at the folks that are helping you, your trusted advisors, who helped you manage $2 million, and now they're potentially going to help you manage $10 million. And you may say to yourself, well, I have a different set of requirements now, and perhaps I need other people. You're also likely going to have people hitting on you. Again, much like lottery winners, where all of a sudden everybody's your best friend, and all of a sudden everybody has the greatest idea for you to invest in. And you're going to have to think about those things, because there may be some situations where you actually do want to invest some money into something. There's going to be other situations where what I find that owners need to do, probably the first thing they need to do if they do come into this quote unquote additional wealth, is they learn to say the word no.
Yeah.
And it's very dangerous not to be able to say the word no, because you can end up into a whole world of hurt. You can end up in a situation where perhaps you're idealistically helping an old friend with perhaps a business venture of some sort, and boy, things go sour. The relationship goes south, and everything just ends up being nasty.
Yeah. Or learn how to sort of paper it and protect yourself, and use the same skill set that would have been honed during the years of owning the business. So it requires thought as well.
Lots of it.
Well, I think we're just about out of time for today. So thank you, Eric. It was interesting to hear sort of the soft side of the issues that people can encounter, and I'm sure there are many more that you often deal with. At this point, I don't think we have a set date for our next podcast, but
we'll let everyone know.
We will let everybody know. And again, because we want to make this something that's helpful to our listeners, anybody who has any ideas or suggestions or would like to hear a particular topic, please just email, and we're more than happy to make that the focus of a subsequent podcast or webcast.